A simple elderly woman mocked at art class, until she paints a masterpiece. Margaret Thompson clutched her worn leather purse tighter as she stood outside the Riverside Community Center in downtown Portland, Oregon. The October morning air carried the scent of fallen maple leaves and fresh coffee from the nearby cafe. At 73, her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore her best cardigan, the navy blue one her late husband Harold had bought her for their 50th anniversary. Through the large windows, she could see easels arranged in a circle, young faces chatting animatedly while mixing paints on wooden pallets. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered her daughter Sarah's words from last week. "Mom, you need to get out more. You've been alone in that house for 2 years now." The Victorian house on Elm Street had become both sanctuary and prison since Harold's passing. Every room held memories, his coffee mug still sitting in the kitchen sink, his reading glasses on the nightstand, the unfinished crossword puzzle folded on his favorite chair. Margaret had always loved drawing as a child, sketching flowers in the margins of her school notebooks, creating elaborate doodles during Sunday sermons at the Methodist church. But life had swept those dreams away like autumn leaves. Marriage, 3 children, decades of managing a household. Art had become a distant memory, buried beneath grocery lists and parent-teacher conferences. Now, with Harold gone and her children busy with their own lives in distant cities, she felt invisible, forgotten. The registration fee had cost her 2 weeks of grocery money, but something deep inside urged her forward. She took a shaky breath, tasting the crisp autumn air mixed with exhaust fumes from the nearby bus stop, and pushed open the heavy glass door. The instructor, a woman in her 30s with paint-splattered apron and fashionably disheveled blonde hair, looked up with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Margaret. Welcome to Advanced Painting Techniques." Advanced! Margaret's stomach dropped like a stone into cold water. She had signed up for beginners. The fluorescent light seemed suddenly too bright, making her feel exposed and out of place. "Actually, I think there's been a mistake," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the chatter of paintbrushes against canvas and the soft jazz music playing from hidden speakers. The instructor, Jessica, checked her tablet with manicured fingers adorned with silver rings. "No mistake here. Margaret Thompson, right?" Around them, the other students, mostly in their 20s and 30s, were already deep into their work, creating bold, abstract pieces with confident strokes. Their conversations drifted over her. Discussions about grad school applications, upcoming gallery shows in the Pearl District, weekend trips to art museums in Seattle. A young man with a carefully groomed beard and vintage flannel shirt snorted softly. Are you sure you're in the right place, Grandma? Maybe the knitting circle is down the hall." His friends giggled, their laughter cutting through Margaret like cold steel. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, the same burning shame she'd felt decades ago when Harold's colleagues would dismiss her opinions at dinner parties, patting her hand condescendingly while changing the subject to Farquhar men's talk. The walls were covered with previous students' work, sophisticated pieces that seemed to mock her simple dreams of painting flowers and landscapes. I paid the full fee," she managed, clutching her registration receipt with trembling fingers. The paper was slightly damp from her nervous perspiration. Jessica's smile faltered slightly, her expression caught between professional politeness and genuine concern. "Of course, you're welcome to stay. But this class does assume previous experience with color theory and composition." Margaret looked at the empty easel in the corner, clearly the only one left. Pushed slightly away from the circle like an afterthought, she could feel 20 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting for her to retreat back to whatever quiet corner of irrelevance they assumed she belonged to. The bearded young man was already back to his canvas, muttering something about participation trophies for seniors. that made his girlfriend suppress another giggle. Margaret's hands trembled as she approached her easel, each step feeling like a small betrayal of her own courage. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was foolish. The smell of turpentine and acrylic paint filled her nostrils, awakening something long dormant. For 3 weeks, Margaret endured the subtle mockery and patronizing comments. The bearded student, whose name she learned was Tyler, would loudly explain basic concepts as if she were deaf or simple. See, Margaret, when you mix blue and yellow, you get green. He'd say with exaggerated patience while his girlfriend Emma rolled her eyes and continued working on her geometric abstractions inspired by her urban planning studies. Margaret's first attempts were indeed clumsy. Her hands, arthritic and unpracticed, struggled to control the brush. Her color choices seemed muddy compared to the vibrant canvases surrounding her, and her perspective was often slightly off, making her attempts at still life look amateurish, beside the sophisticated conceptual pieces her classmates produced. During break times, she'd sit alone in the corner next to the large windows overlooking the Willamette River, sipping coffee from a paper cup, while the younger students formed animated clusters near the supply table. They discussed gallery openings in the arts district, debated the merits of various contemporary artists she'd never heard of, and shared Instagram photos of their latest pieces with the casual sophistication of people who'd never questioned their right to create. Some evenings, Margaret would sit in Harold's old recliner, staring at her paint-stained fingers and wondering if Sarah had been wrong. The house felt especially quiet on those nights, the old furnace clicking on and off, the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time with relentless precision. Maybe some people were simply too old to learn new things, she thought, watching the evening news reports about achievement and success that seemed reserved for the young. But then she'd remember the feeling of the brush in her hand, the way the paint seemed to have its own life as it moved across the canvas, and something stirred in her chest, a flutter of the girl she'd once been. On Thursday of the 4th week, she arrived early, parking her old Honda Civic in the nearly empty lot. She found Tyler struggling with his latest piece, a portrait of his girlfriend that looked stiff and lifeless despite his technical skill and expensive supplies. Without thinking, Margaret quietly suggested he try softer edges around the eyes, making them more vulnerable. He looked at her suspiciously but made the adjustment. The painting immediately came alive, Emma's personality suddenly shining through the careful brushstrokes. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt useful, needed. "How did you know that would work?" Tyler asked, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity and something that might have been respect. Margaret set down her coffee cup, her weathered hands steady for the first time in weeks. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the silver in her hair, making it shine like spun silk. "I used to paint," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "A long time ago." The confession hung in the air like morning mist over the river. She hadn't spoken about those years to anyone, not even Harold, who'd known only that she'd tried art school for a while before they'd married. Tyler set down his brush, wiping his hands on a paint-stained rag, his attention fully focused on her now. Even Emma looked up from her work, her usual air of millennial impatience replaced by something approaching interest. In 1968, fresh out of high school, in rural Montana where her father ran a struggling wheat farm, she'd earned a full scholarship to study art at the University of Washington. For 2 glorious years, she'd lived and breathed painting. Her small dorm room in McMahon Hall filled with canvases depicting the rolling wheat fields of her childhood, the vast Montana sky, the way light moved across the prairie like water. Her professor, Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, had called her work luminous and emotionally profound, predicting a bright future in fine arts. Margaret had dreamed of showing her work in galleries, of traveling to Europe to study the masters, of making a living doing what she loved most. But then she'd met Harold at a campus dance, fallen in love with his steady kindness and practical dreams, and when he'd proposed with a modest ring and visions of a stable life in Portland, where he'd landed a good job with the Postal Service, she'd made the choice that seemed right for a young woman in 1970. Marriage was security. Art was uncertainty. She'd packed away her paints and enrolled in secretarial school, trading her dreams for what everyone assured her was a more sensible future. I thought I was too old to start again, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the truth she'd buried for decades. But watching all of you these past weeks, seeing your passion and dedication, I remembered something Dr. Morgan used to say. Art isn't about age or proving yourself to others. It's about truth, your truth. Jessica had been listening from across the room, pretending to organize supplies while actually hanging on every word. She approached slowly, her expression thoughtful, as if seeing Margaret clearly for the first time. Margaret, would you like to try something different today? Something from your heart instead of the exercises we've been doing? Margaret chose a large canvas, bigger than anything she'd attempted in the class, its white surface stretching before her like an invitation to rediscover herself. As she squeezed colors onto her palette, cadmium yellow bright as summer sun, burnt sienna deep as Montana earth, Prussian blue vast as prairie sky, the familiar alchemy began. Her fingers remembered the weight of the paint, the way colors sang when they touched each other. The room around her faded away, the chatter of other students becoming distant white noise, and she was 17 again, standing in her father's wheat field at sunrise, watching the light transform everything it touched into gold. Her brush moved with purpose now, laying down broad strokes of golden yellow that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, each movement guided by muscle memory she'd thought was lost forever. She worked for hours, barely aware of the other students gradually gathering quietly around her easel, their own projects forgotten. This wasn't the tentative dabbing of a beginner, but the confident technique of someone who understood how light played across surfaces, how shadow could be both absence and presence, how color could carry emotion across decades. The wheat field emerged layer by layer, not photorealistic, but something deeper, more essential. She painted the weight of the grain heavy on its stalks, bending in the morning wind that she could almost feel on her face again. The infinite sky stretched toward horizons that promised both endings and beginnings, clouds that spoke of rain and renewal. In the corner of the canvas, almost hidden in the golden stalks, she painted a small figure, herself at 17, arms outstretched to embrace the vast Montana sky, her face turned toward a future full of possibility. Her hands moved without conscious thought, 50 years of suppressed creativity flowing through her fingers like a river finally freed from a dam. This was what she'd lost, what she'd set aside for marriage and motherhood, and the 1,000 small compromises that had seemed so necessary at the time. Not just the skill, but the joy, the sense of connection to something larger than herself, the feeling that she was exactly where she belonged. When she finally stepped back, her lower back aching from hours of standing, the late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, casting her painting in natural light that made the painted wheat seem to move and breathe with life. The studio had fallen completely silent, even Tyler's usual commentary stilled by what he was witnessing. The silence stretched for long seconds before Tyler whispered, "Jesus, Margaret, this is incredible." His voice carried a reverence she'd never heard from him before, and she realized that somewhere during those hours of painting, the gap between them had disappeared. They were simply two artists recognizing truth in each other's work. Emma nodded slowly, her usual sarcasm replaced by genuine awe, her smartphone forgotten in her hand for once. "It's like I can feel the wind. I can smell the wheat." Other students murmured agreement, clustering closer to study the brushwork, the way Margaret had captured light with such economy and power. Jessica approached the painting with the careful reverence usually reserved for museum pieces, her art history training evident in how she examined each section. Her eyes moved across every brushstroke, taking in the subtle color variations, the masterful use of light and shadow, the emotional depth that elevated technique into art. Margaret, this is gallery quality. No, this is better than most gallery pieces I've seen in Portland. Word spread quickly through the community center like ripples in still water. By the end of the week, Margaret's Wheatfield painting was hanging in the lobby with a small placard reading Montana Morning by Margaret Thompson, drawing visitors who had never stepped foot in an art class. People would stop and stare, some for long minutes, lost in the painted landscape that somehow captured not just a place, but a feeling, a memory of simpler times and endless possibilities. The local newspaper, the Oregonian, ran a feature story about the hidden master who had rediscovered her calling, complete with a photograph of Margaret standing proudly beside her work. But more than the attention, more than the validation she'd craved for so long, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The quiet confidence that comes from being truly seen, from knowing that her voice mattered, that her vision had value. Tyler approached her after the final class, his paint-stained hands clasped nervously in front of him, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "I owe you an apology," he said simply, his young face earnest in the late afternoon light. "I was an ass. I thought because you were older, you didn't belong here." Margaret smiled, her eyes crinkling with the warmth that comes from forgiveness freely given. "You're young. I was young once too, and just as certain I knew everything. The wonderful thing about art is that it humbles us all eventually." She began packing her supplies, real supplies now, professional-grade brushes and paints that Sarah had ordered online after seeing the newspaper article. Her daughter had driven up from Sacramento that weekend, tears streaming down her face as she recognized something in her mother she'd never seen before. Not the woman who had sacrificed her dreams for family, but the artist who had always lived within her, waiting patiently for her moment to emerge. Margaret's journey back to art had cost her far more than the registration fee. It had required her to confront 50 years of choices, to forgive herself for dreams deferred, to find the courage to begin again when most people would be thinking about endings. But standing there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by canvases that told stories only she could tell, watching Tyler pack up his own work with new humility and respect, she knew every sacrifice had been worth it. The Wheatfield painting would eventually hang in a small gallery in the Pearl District, selling to a collector who saw in it something that spoke to his own memories of childhood summers in Kansas. But for Margaret, the real masterpiece wasn't the painting. It was the reclamation of herself, the discovery that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. As she walked to her car, easel under her arm, she could already see her next painting in her mind. Harold's garden in spring, full of the roses he'd loved so much.